This morning's sermon really came from a lot of reflection in that, just by everybody here has been in the temple, so you know that I serve as a lay leader when pastor is gone. And there's a lectionary that the Methodist Church gives you that gives you verses to do your sermon. And it either comes from the Old Testament or one of the Gospels, or a letter from Paul, or based on one of the Psalms. In the Gospel this time was again from Luke on the story of Mary and Martha. And it seems to me, Pastor and I both would say, it seems like we've both done about a half dozen sermons on Mary and Martha in the last 2 years. And I sat down with the planning committee with Aaron and Joy to plan out the service, and the scripture that Bruce read, thank you Bruce, from Amos really struck me at least, because it's a message that we don't hear often, but I think is desperately needed to be heard. And if you listened or read the scripture, you can hear that there's some tough things that are going to come, some tough medicine. And they always say that if you take a little candy before the medicine, it might go down smooth. So I have a little candy for you. Was Solomon's temple located? On the side of his head. Who was the smartest man in the Bible?
Abraham.
Why? Because he knew a lot.
Oh.
Okay. Who's the greatest comedian in the Bible? Samson, because he brought the house down. What kind of car was made for apostles to drive? Honda, because the apostles are all on one accord. Okay, last one. What time of day was Adam created? A little before Eve. Hopefully that loosens you up, because you may not be so comfortable after this. This reading that Bruce read for us talks about the vision that the prophet Amos had received. And God showed him a basket of summer fruit that included Mediterranean fruits such as pomegranates, figs, grapes, and it symbolized the pronouncement of doom upon Israel. And you would wonder, what does a fruit basket have to do with the impending doom of a nation? Well, the vision relies on a Hebrew pun. The term for summer fruits is quays, which is a term for the inn quails. Now, these two words sound so similar in the dialect spoken in Israel that it usually is a play on words. So, in the New Testament, in the new NIV, it says, "The time is right for my people of Israel." It's a pun that is taken through all of the different prophetic images of God's judgment. In this scenario, God has made it very clear to the leadership of the Israel people that they are guilty of upholding an unfair and an unjust system. That they are accused of hypocrisy by allowing the religious festivals to take place, allowing shopkeepers to close up their shops, and yet be able to raise their prices. There's a term called an ephah, which is a unit of measure. And when they say make the ephah small, that means that the container that you would have as a bushel of grain would be made smaller, but they would increase the measure, the amount of a shekel. So a lot of times if you bought a bushel ephah of wheat, a lot of times, one, it may not be filled with real wheat. Sometimes they would sweep in the chaff from the wheat and still charge a higher price. They were also known just to exploit the poor in so many different ways. A lot of times during the festivals that closed up the shops, people were still asked to bring offerings to the religious leaders. So these corrupt merchants in Israel found themselves still taking in these profits and wondering how much more their lives could be enhanced. They figured that no matter what was going to take place, they were due to get theirs. They had no regard for the needy, only for the greedy. When we hear in Amos that he wants to make sure that the people need to be free from oppression, he's speaking not just to those who are oppressed, but to the oppressors. He wants to make sure that there are people who know God cares. And so that the oppressors could care less. And when we have this title that we call Full Pockets but Empty Hearts, these are the people who have filled their pockets unfairly off of the backs and the hard work of others. When you were asked to give an offering in those days, it was going to be measured out to make sure that it met what the religious leaders had asked for. And so if you were short, you were asked to bring more. And so it goes that those who had less were demanded to bring more. We see that this is not the first time this happens in the Old Testament. It was known in Deuteronomy and in Leviticus why God had asked everyone to deal with each other fairly. But in this case, it is such that it's so egregious that God says that not only will I bring natural disasters to you, to the people, but I will cause a famine of my word. He didn't say a famine of the crops. He didn't say a famine, a lack of water. He said a famine of my word. And I want us to just take the time to think about that. What would that mean if we heard no word of hope? If we heard no word of love or of sacrifice? If where your lot in life was what you had and there was no changing from that? Would we be able to persevere as a society? Would we even have a church now that knowing that there was no hope, that your plot in life was determined from the moment you were born? I think that God makes sure that when he says that there's going to be this famine of the heart, that he's making sure that those who are oppressed know that there is hope, but the oppressors know that there are consequences. He talks about how there can be both physical as well as ecological and economic destruction coming their way. That the promised land will soon be a death trap to all of its inhabitants. That the Nile will rise and fall every year and cause great damage in its flooding. It reminds me of a friend of mine who just got back from Louisiana last week, from New Orleans. He said said literally 4 hours after he left, he heard from his family there that literally got flooded out of their homes. As Ruth brought up, that there is an uncommon heat wave going on in the middle of the country on the East Coast. I think we've all become aware of what the dangers are of what is scientifically known as a climate change. We're moving to a climate crisis. All these things are not necessarily transactional by God, but they are kind of like history. There's a rhythm. These things happen, and yet God comes through to make sure, one, that those who are in need hear his word, but two, those who shy away from his word know that there are consequences. I want to take a small time out to just share with you a story from the American War history. We just went through the 4th of July. And I think those of you who don't know the story of Benedict Arnold, who was an American general who turned to a traitor. To this day, people talk about someone who is a turncoat, who is treacherous in their ways, as a Benedict Arnold. He gave away the plans that were to help the British take over the West Point. But a background story to that is that there was a British major who Benedict Arnold collaborated with by the name of John Andre, who was also carrying documents that would expose the treachery of Arnold. And so his commander, Henry Clinton, made a very eloquent speech to have Andre released from being captured, but to no avail. He made sure that he got word even to Alexander Hamilton, who heard that Andre was to be betrothed to a wonderful young lady back overseas, that he had been promised to raise this family, that he had been dutiful in all his responsibilities as a righteous soldier, and that he was confident in what he was doing was right and in his just cause, and that he did not deserve death for his treachery. And so he was a really nice, affable, relatable person. And George Washington, at the time, head of the American troops, was really torn between what his decision was going to be. Because he could have easily traded Andre for either arms or for other prisoners who were captured by the British. But when he found out that John Andre was not who he said he was a philanderer. He purposely lied to anybody he betrayed. He took advantage of those who actually gave him funds and ammunition under the guise that he would protect them if ever they would fall under enemy arms, knowing full well that he had given these documents to say they were either to be imprisoned or killed. And so George Washington had a decision to make about the consequences for John Andre. The consequences could have been, again, make a trade, send him back and bring others. He could have had him simply imprisoned. But instead, he chose death by hanging. Now, in military terms, if you were a man of honor, you would have been shot. Now, to me, dead is dead, but to be dishonored by being hung meant that you were an unworthy person of military honor. And so this was the consequence of a judgment for someone who seemed to be of, let's say, pious means, but took advantage of people who couldn't fend for themselves. And how does that relate to this story, to Amos? Because in Amos we find that God is asking us not to turn from him. To ask, what are we doing for God? Are we mistreating those? Are we betraying those who are now under our leadership? Are we only looking to our own good, as we heard from the message? Looking toward the weekend only to fill our pockets, yet our souls are empty. I think we are at a point in time where this prophecy of Amos is before us. That we can find ourselves with a divided nation with divided leadership. And without calling names, I think we all know that we need to be in deep prayer, because we have people who are easily misled who claim to follow Christ. And yet, the way of Jesus is to love the least of those, is to care for our neighbors, for the visitor inside our gate. It calls for us to not offer weak offerings, but the best of what we have. But there's a lot of superficial, what I want to call piety given toward God in these days and times. And that we have a tendency to overlook our own sins and press them on those who have been faithful, those who are looking for justice, looking for peace, looking for a way in which they can be dealt with as full human beings. So this stern punishment that God calls for the nation of Israel is because its leaders have led them astray. And the people did not rise up to call them on their misdeeds. So, where Amos takes us today is that the good fruit that has been given to you, if you allow it to rot, it not only rots as fruit, but it rots as nourishment for you. You need to be able to look with God with impunity, not to rebel against him, but to know that you can prosper with him when you share his fruit. But the judgment is clear. The judgment is clear that God will leave a famine in our hearts if we do not abide by his word. Now, I have to say that reading this and putting this together really struck me as being somewhat harsh. And yet, we need to know that there are consequences in moving toward love, but also when we move away from it. That we cannot find some lukewarm response. God is calling us to repent from our ways in love. He embraces us all, and he gave us all in his Son, Jesus Christ, so that we can be united with him. But I have to come back to this final point with this, is just as John Andre and Alexander Hamilton and all of his supporters had deceived themselves in thinking they were doing the right thing when brought to light, they were only serving themselves and filling their pockets. So it will be in our time, in our generation, for those who would ignore and adhere to that and ignore God's word. He will bring a judgment to those who think they're not such bad people, but do bad deeds. I want to leave you with this. Our God is patient. And his patience often gives people the impression that he will not insist on our life to be judged according to his law and his will. But the fact is, in reality, he does insist. He will insist. And he will make it plain as day that the determination of justice will be done. And so, please, may your prayers be uplifted for those who are weak, for those who are suffering, for those who are displaced.